This year, we're going to be learning a lot about grammar, about the way sentences are structured. And I think it's important for you to know going in that this is not a made up set of rules that somebody wrote down on a piece of paper and then everybody has to follow them. That's not how grammar works. So what I want you to kind of think about, let's take it out of grammar for a second and let's talk about the game of basketball. Excuse me. I happen to know a lot about the history of basketball. It started back in 1891 in at a small college, and a guy named James Naismith was a teacher at that college, and so he took his students were supposed to be playing outside that day. He was taking them outside for exercise, and it was too cold. It was too rainy, and so they stayed inside. They didn't have a gymnasium because basketball hadn't been invented yet. But they did have a ballroom, and the ballroom had a balcony around the top. So Naismith took a peach basket, like the one you see in his hand there. He took a peach basket and he climbed up on a ladder and he nailed the peach basket to the wall at a pretty high height. And they took a volleyball and they tried to invent a game as they were, just to waste time or to spend the time that they had. They invented a game where they were trying to throw that volleyball and make it stick in the peach basket. And they would get points for doing that. And then at the end of the peach basket, at the end of, once the ball went in the peach basket, then they had to get the ladder out and climb all the way back up and get it back out again. Here is an image of the peach basket nailed to the wall. You can see how high that is. Incidentally, that comes down to us. We have a metal rim with a cloth net tied around it, and somehow we still call it a basket. That doesn't look like a normal basket. It does in basketball, but it doesn't look like what you would think of as a basket in any other part of life. But it started off looking like a peach basket nailed to the wall, and we've retained the name basket ever since. Eventually, they cut the hole out of the bottom. They didn't have a set of rules. They had to make them up as they went. So the first rule was throw the ball in the basket and you get a point. Then all of a sudden they said, okay, well, what happens if we try to stop that person from throwing it in the basket? Well, then they invented defense. And then they said, well, I'm going to throw it to somebody else and they can throw it in the basket. Or I'm going to take the ball and I'm going to run with it to try to throw it in the basket. And they stopped and said, hey, hold on a second. You can't run with it. No running with the ball. So they invented the concept of traveling and not being able to travel with the ball. So you could pass the ball, and the people who didn't have the ball, they could run around, but the person who was holding the ball had to stand still, and that became a rule of basketball. Then somebody said, well, what happens if I pass the ball to myself? I'll throw the ball on the ground, and it'll bounce back up. And then as long as I keep doing that, I can keep running around on the court there came the concept of dribbling. So these things developed naturally. They developed organically. They developed in a way that made sense, that made it fair for everybody who was playing the game on both sides, the offense and the defense. It made it fair for both of them. They nailed another basket to the other side of the gym, and then you had to run up and down the court to try to, put the ball in the correct basket. All of these things developed. And then after they developed and after they kind of figured them out by playing them, then they started writing down the rules. Okay, you can't run with the ball, and you can pass it to somebody, and you can guard that person, but you can't hit that person. You can't punch him in the face and take the ball away. That would be unfair. So they called that a foul. So along comes this guy for the Minneapolis Lakers. That's where the Los Angeles Lakers used to be. The Minneapolis Lakers, his name is George Mikan, and he's the first really dominant player in basketball. He's taller than everybody else. And at this time, every time a basket gets scored in the game, they go back to center court and have another jump ball. Well, George Mikan is so big and so athletic, he wins all the jump balls. So his team gets the ball. He tips it to one of his teammates. Then George Mikan runs down and he stands right under the basket. And he's super tall and he can jump. So they throw the ball real high. He grabs it. He turns around, puts it in the basket. They score a basket. They go back out to half court. They do another jump ball and do the same thing all over again. And basketball got really boring because he was very dominant. So they came up with another rule to make everything fair. All right, no longer can a player stand inside, like, right next to the basket. You got to stay away. So they drew a lane on the floor. They drew they painted some lines on the floor, and they said you can't stay in that area. You can go in that area, but you have to leave that area. You can only stay in there a maximum of 3 seconds. And it started out being a really narrow area that was only about 6 feet wide. As you can see in this picture right here, the foul circle, which is 12 feet wide, much wider than the actual lane itself. In fact, it's that appearance, especially with the lines and the block on that on the key, the area that we call the lane or the key. You can see why it might be called a key, because it actually has the appearance of an older type of key that you would actually use in a door lock. So we still use that. Just like we use basket, we still use key, because that's what it has the appearance of. Eventually, so they put rules in to stop George Mikan's dominance. They would eventually put in rules to stop dominance of players like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. They, for a while, college basketball outlawed dunking because he was so dominant that, he just destroyed everybody. His team won 88 games in a row in college over a course of several years. And even when he was in the NBA, his dominance inside and the dominance of other big men led to a desire to have a more open game where people weren't packed inside so much. So they developed a 3-point line. If there were no 3-point line, you wouldn't know who Steph Curry is, because Steph Curry would not be able to be successful in basketball, because as a little guy, if those shots from the outside only counted as 2, they'd always throw the ball inside. But because the shots from outside the 3-point line count for more, it encourages people to shoot them. And now you have a star in people like Steph Curry and other players who like to shoot the 3-point basket. My point is, the game of basketball continues to evolve. It continues to change. They put in new tweaks to the rules every year, and the whole goal there is to make it the best game possible. In English, the rules are the same way. I know it doesn't seem like it, but in English, the rules are the same way. The language developed. Eventually, somebody set out to write down the rules for the English language. Well, here's what makes for sentences that are successful. In successful sentences, especially when people are reading, we know that those sentences start with a capital letter. That gives a clue to the reader, hey, we're starting something new. And it ends in a period, so the person can stop and say, okay, I just finished a complete thought. Let me process that before I move on. And when we start to connect ideas together to show how they're related, then we also, there are certain things that we've noticed, well, that really works well, and those other things don't really work all that well. So we learn things like compound sentences and complex sentences, dependent clauses, independent clauses, comma rules, all those things. Those are descriptions. They're not rules that somebody set out that we have to follow. Those are descriptions of what makes good writing, what makes good speaking, what makes you understandable when you are communicating. And so I think it's important for us to start out the year knowing that it's all a description of effective communication. It's not some rules that somebody in a tie that was a little bit too tight came up just to make students miserable. This is the key to effective communication. If you understand that, maybe the grammar stuff won't seem quite so bad.